we have to talk about some of the problems that Genesis format is facing. Make sure you guys smash the leveling crap out of that subscribe button so you guys don't miss out more content. So evidently, Magical Scientist has been causing quite a lot of problems in Genesis format. It being a one-card FTK is kind of problematic, honestly. Now, you gotta remember, Konami wants to promote Genesis format as this tournament structure that will have ideas that can kind of creep out of the woodwork, which I don't think is necessarily the worst concept and idea around here, but let's call it what it is. Having Magical Scientist creeping around in the format as a one-card FTK can be a little bit annoying. I'm not going to be the one person to tell you that, that's not problematic. But at this stage, people, are you really surprised to see? This is the same thing that we've seen creeping around with, a lot of the other band stuff that's doing its thing. And I mean, Exodia is another big one to discuss on the Genesis bandwagon of problematic cards. If you have a consistent method to get to these broken cards, then of course you are going to have issues. That's exactly what this is about. I assume that with the idea of having this FTK running around, that they will have to do some point redistributions along the way to try to make the deck a little bit more counterbalanced, because from what I'm kind of seeing here, that tends to be, the thing. Offset the problematic cards, and congratulations, you've taken care of the problems. But I didn't think Mystical Space Type, or excuse me, I didn't think Magical Scientist would be a problem, but okay. Now, I guess we should talk about the Mystical Space Typhoon deck, right? Radiant Typhoon has been dubbed a problem deck because this deck just generates so much advantage. It's crazy, man. It's kind of cool to me to see that Radiant Typhoon is able to span through all of these free bodies and actually, generate this free, good stuff. And that's a good thing. But once again, if you're generating too much advantage too quickly, and especially since we've seen this deck notoriously popping up with, runic cards, and you're using these cards as forms of interruption against the opponent, not only to, banish out their resources, but to, also generate these free advantage systems, well, that turns into a little bit of a problem. Once again, a lot of the complaints I read about the Mystical Space Typhoon archetype are the fact that the deck just generates way too much advantage for free. And obviously, I think we can all agree, man, getting a free body that specials, that can search for MSTs in a format where, honestly, MST is God, all right? Being able to take out key problem cards that your opponent is saying, oh, nice Fiendish Chain, MST. You tried to stop me? Haha. I'll go ahead and re-pull back my MST. You will have no domination and access to these sorts of, back row. And that's a little bit of a problem. This deck does need a point restriction on it, because when you're having pieces be way too consistently involved on the side of, hey, look, we can start the chain of, oh, by the way, my boss monster basically can't be popped, and you can't really do anything to that. You run into a lot of issues along that way. So evidently, Punk can also do the Mjolnir lock against people. So this was actually a fairly recent complaint that was popping up, because I've seen in the past that, we could do the spell canceller lock in Genesis format, which I guess is a little bit problematic. You can tend to thank K9 cards for allowing these sorts of interactions to come up. But now you're telling me out here that Punk can use, Zombie Vampire and things like that. From what I was reading, it usually has to do with Quinguri, because you'd be like, oh, we don't have Dagda running around this format. We shouldn't have any of the issues of getting access to Mjolnir. No, there are other ways to kind of go around it. And also, shooting Riser, the level 7 synchro, I guess, can be part of this as well. I do agree that you shouldn't have locks in Genesis format. At least they should be fixed when they actually come up, which, once again, I mean, that's kind of problematic, right? Why should Punk be allowed to do this kind of initial synchro setup and actually kind of break, the mold on, these sorts of mentality stepping away from things? But kudos to seeing Punk actually do something. I've seen a lot of Punk. All right, like the deck has been kind of picking up a little bit of steam here. And to kind of see that, we can go, oh, hey, Punk is finally getting a chance to do something. Maybe it's a little bit more unfair, but that is 3 potentially problematic things that I think we need to have checked here, people. If Punk is really consistently pulling off these Mjolnir loops in Genesis format, that's a little bit of a problem. Now, I want to talk about new deck syndrome here. So there's this really, really lopsided thing with Genesis format that I'm sure you've probably noticed, and it's the new decks coming out. Every new set, you're going to see support entering into the fray here, right? Oh my gosh, Doom Z just came out. There's no point allocation to it. Oh no. We either have to wait for point allocations to come down from the top, or the new strong deck in the room is just going to kind of obliterate you out of the water, and that becomes a little bit of a problem. The best decks in Genesis format are the decks that can use basically their core strategy and then can use hand traps to top things off. But guess what, everybody? That's where we have the lopsided game theory coming into play here, where all of these new decks are going to be the best decks coming into Genesis. I would like to, I guess, look at Vanquishal, for example. They got one new card in the form of Holly Sue, which Holly Sue was an incredibly strong card, all right? But they didn't have Rock the Vanquisher, they didn't have this. A lot of people didn't think the Vanquishal, needed those point restrictions. But when you looked at the K9 cards hitting the ground running, you realize, oh crap, we cannot allow these problematic new cards to exist. That's why we saw some very heavy point allocations within 2 days of the format. Because guess what, everybody? You're running into the new... So this once again comes back to the MST deck here with Radiant Typhoon. Radiant Typhoon is able to generate all of these free bodies and is able to call back up all of these, walls, searching for MST and, another monster. It turns into too much free advantage. Now, I understand there has to be a regulatory period for these decks, but this is always going to be kind of the problem you're going to see from Genesis format going forward here. Every new theme that is going to come out, every core set, you may as well get ahead of testing it, because you'll probably have a month in Genesis format for Konami to, or before they have to make some sort of hits to that. But I guess my concern here is, will they actually take preemptive hits to try to clean up problems, or are these just going to be things that are going to take a little bit of time and we're going to have to sit here and kind of twiddle our thumbs and be like, well, I can't wait to actually just get bullied by this new archetype for a month of Genesis for the people that were able to pick it up in advance. It's almost like, you get to play a pretty competent deck until, oops, we have to ban list it out and start taking it apart. But I guess this is one of the coin flips of Genesis format. If you've got money and you can pick up a new theme, you'll be able to play it pretty consistently for a little while. But on the same, equation, it's going to take you a little bit to, to see regulations and things come down from that. But these are the current problems being faced by a good amount of people, that I have seen talking about Genesis format right now. Whether or not consistency is a problem, one card FTKs exist, these are problems that we have to be very, very careful about and letting them exist in the current capacity. So what do you guys think? Please do comment down below, tell me what you guys think, and I will see your beautiful faces back here in a day, guys. Patrons! Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. Check out these other videos.